Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our chats with Emily, as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are in the Thomas H. Johnson edition, the complete poems of Emily Dickinson volume. And we turn now to poem 675, Essential Oils Are Wrung. Now, guys, this is one of Emily's most commented on poems. So many people love the fact that the word essential gets used right away. Think about the contemporary that Emily has in Henry David Thoreau. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately and to front only the, what does he say? Essential facts of life. So the use of the word essential, many, like Christine Miller, the scholar, has said this is an essential poem, that if one is going to spend time studying Emily closely, an essential poem. With that in mind, let me just go ahead and say right away what I have said a number of times in our studies together. We're not going to be able to give real, true depth and credence to this poem in our exegesis. This will be epidermal, and no pun is intended there when I use that phrase, epidermal, as we get into the poem itself. Now, in many ways, we're back to earlier study. Do you guys remember when we did 448? This was a poet. It is that distills amazing sense from ordinary meanings and attar so immense, the production of Rose. From the familiar species that perished by the door, we wonder it was not ourselves arrested it before. Of pictures the disclosure, the poet, it is he, entitles us by contrast to ceaseless poverty, or of portion so unconscious the robbing could not harm, himself to him a fortune exterior to time. And then do you guys remember when we did 543? I fear a man of frugal speech, I fear a silent man, haranguer I can overtake, or babbler entertain, but he who weigheth, while the rest expend their furthest pound, of this man I am weary, I fear that he is grand. Now, there is an interesting quote that we want to share with you. The poem here might have been suggested by Thomas Higginson's precept that, quote, literature is an attar of roses, one distilled drop from a million blossoms. That was contained in his letter to a young contributor of April 1862 that Emily would have read. We've commented on the power of Higginson in a number of earlier lectures, and that leads us to our assumptions. We are assuming here that you have been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily is our playlist. We also are hopeful that not only the introductory comments have been followed, but as well the preceding 674 poems. And if you have done that reading, as we've already said about 448 and 543, then we're going to hear lots and lots of echoes. Why? Because this is another poem about poetry, another musing on inspiration and the muse. And in that regards, think of it this way. Literally, Emily writes all these poems and then she leaves them for her sister Lavinia and of course others like Sue in a drawer to be found after her death. This is another poem about poetic inspiration and the violent screws that are necessary for that. In that regards, we'll go back to earlier poems like Success is counted sweetest, but by those who ne'er succeed. To comprehend a nectar requires sorest need. And in many ways, I think standing behind this, and scholars have argued that maybe Emily is responding specifically to a couple of Shakespearean sonnets. You guys will remember when we studied Sonnet 5 of Shakespeare, there was this line, then were not summer's distillations left, a liquid prisoner pent in walls of glass. Beauty's effect with beauty were bereft. Nor in remembrance what it was, but flowers distilled, though they with winter meet, lease but their show, their substance still lives sweet. And then you'll remember in Sonnet 54, there's this line, sweet roses do not so, of their sweet deaths are sweetest odors made. And so of you, beauteous and lovely youth, when that shall fade, my verse distills your truth. This idea of poetic truth as being distillation will be central, I think, to our study as well. Let's enjoy what some have referenced as the 8 lines that in so many ways capture Emily's project. Essential oils are wrung, the attar from the rose, be not expressed by suns alone, it is the gift of screws. The general rose decay, but this in lady's drawer makes summer when the lady lie in ceaseless rosemary. Now, many have said that Shakespeare standing, you'll remember in our previous poem, 674, we talked about the diviner crowd, and we mentioned the possibility of Shakespeare. And I think it's very possible that some of Shakespeare is standing behind this set of poems, and we mentioned these two sonnets already, but as well the play Hamlet. And you'll remember that in that play, we've given full lectures at learnstrong.net on that play, you'll remember that Ophelia is handing out flowers as she departs to go and, of course, tragically to die, mermaid-like, we're told. You'll remember in Hamlet 4:5 that Ophelia will say, there's rosemary, that's for remembrance, pray, love, remember. Now, let's work through this interesting argument of where poetic inspiration comes from. First of all, notice it's essential oils, i.e. perfume, right? Although obviously could be referencing her poems, and many have argued this much. Or, notice her verbs in this poem. Wrung, right? In other words, they're pulled apart, they're pulled out. The attar from the rose. In other words, we will have the essence of the rose. It's drawn out from the rose to provide perfume. Be not expressed by suns alone. Maybe the key word of the poem is the word alone. And then what is it? What are these essential oils? These, if you will, poems of Emily's? Well, they're the gift of screws. Now, you'll remember screws from our study of 263. In other words, how does one make perfume from roses? Well, we put it in some kind of press and we screw it down, and it is those juices that will escape the rose that we will qualify as the perfume, which then, to finish the poem, the general rose, that is to say just the rose that dies without the screws, will decay. But the perfume, this, in lady's drawer, again, the irony that Emily will leave her poems for posterity in her drawer. In lady's drawer, make summer, right? When obviously the petals of the rose will drop in autumn and then be dead by winter. When the lady lie in ceaseless rosemary. In other words, long after she's dead, the rose. There is evidence of the rose vis-a-vis the perfume. Now, I think the argument that's being made here at 2a is that, as one scholar has said, both perfume and art are the gift of screws. In other words, the challenge, the tightening, if you will. Another scholar has said about this poem that all that is good and valuable in life is achieved through some kind of suffering, i.e. the screws. Another scholar, Christine Miller, who her classic Poet's Grammar about Emily's poetry, she begins with this poem, and she argues you have to know this poem well to be able to really read Emily's poetry. She says it this way: the rose, or life that lives only in the sun, unexpressed, does not put forth essence. That is to say, there must be some contraction, there must be some pressing down, there must be some getting beneath the epidermis if one is really going to appreciate the power of the poetry. At 2b, think about the word choices here of wrung and screws and decay, and the S sounds as well, right? Suns, screws, summer, ceaseless. At 3a, we mentioned Shakespeare, of course, in Sonnet 5 and 54, but I think a lot of John Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn is also standing behind this poem. We've given full lectures at learnstrong.net. Think about the power of the argument in Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, that somehow the work of art, still unravished bride of quietness and slow time, will ultimately outlive the artist. And there's something profound about that, right? And what is it that is ultimately said there? Truth is beauty, beauty, truth. That's all you know on earth and all you need to know. In other words, there's a certain kind of speaking beyond the artist, the craft, the poet, the crafter, the poet. Finally, at 3b, to own a poem like this, do you think it's true in your own life that it is the suffering that actually produces the perfume in your life? I hope Emily's challenging you. Thank you.